I do regret that I have almost nothing to leave you and your mother. A few old books no one else would want. I never made any money to speak of, and I never paid any attention to the money I had. It was the furthest thing from my mind that I'd be leaving a wife and child, believe me. I'd have been a better father if I'd known. I'd have set something by for you. So this is Gilead by Marilynne Robinson. The narrator, John Ames, is a pastor in his mid-70s who's received news that he has a terminal heart condition. He has a young wife and a 7-year-old son, as odd as that sounds, that he'll leave behind. This book is set in the 1950s, and it's in the fictional town of Gilead, Iowa. And this book is John's letter to his son. So a few thoughts to start with is, this guy's in a tough situation. I'm a father of 3 daughters, and it's hard for me to imagine, being given the news that I'm going to pass before I have the opportunity to teach them everything that I possibly can. All of life's lessons that are taught as certain situations come up and are taught over an extended period of time, where you're able to reiterate certain things. So John Ames is given limited time, and he's trying to compact everything he can into this letter to his son. So that's a tough situation to be in. All right, so in the first part of this book, we learn a little bit more about John Ames. He's a pastor, like I mentioned, and he came from a long line of pastors. We learn about his grandfather, who was a pastor back during the Civil War, and who ended up becoming an active abolitionist during that time. We learn about John Ames' father, who was also a pastor, but against the Civil War, and so that became a source of tension between John's father and John's grandfather. And we also learn about John's older brother, Edward, who left the very small town of Gilead, Iowa, and went off to college over in Europe and came back an atheist. But John looks up to that older brother very much, and I think he still does, even at this late stage of life. So let's go to the book. I've always been taller than most, larger than most. It runs in my family. When I was a boy, people took me to be older than I was and often expected more of me. More common sense, usually, than I could come up with at the time. I got pretty good at pretending I understood more than I did, a skill which has served me through life. I say this because I want you to realize that I'm not by any means a saint. My life does not compare with my grandfather's. I get much more respect than I deserve. This seems harmless enough in most cases. People want to respect the pastor, and I'm not going to interfere with that. But I've developed a great reputation for wisdom by ordering more books than I ever have time to read, and reading more books, by far, than I learned anything useful from, except, of course, that some very tedious gentlemen have written books. This is not a new insight, but the truth of it is something you have to experience to fully grasp. Thank God for them all, of course, and for that strange interval, which was most of my life when I read out of loneliness, and when bad company was much better than no company. You can love a bad book for its haplessness or pomposity or gall, if you have that starveling appetite for things human, which I devoutly hope you never will have. The full soul loatheth an honeycomb, but to the hungry soul every bitter thing is sweet. There are pleasures to be found where you would never look for them. There's a bit of fatherly wisdom, but it's also the Lord's truth, and a thing I know from my own long experience. Often enough, when someone saw the light burning in my study long into the night, it only meant that I'd fallen asleep in my chair. My reputation is largely the creature of the kindly imaginings of my flock, whom I chose not to disillusion, in part because the truth had the kind of pathos in it that would bring on sympathy in its least bearable forms. Well, my life was known to them all, every significant aspect of it, and they were tactful. I've spent a good share of my life comforting the afflicted, but I could never endure the thought that anyone should try to comfort me, except old Boughton, who always knew better than to talk much. He was such an excellent friend to me in those days, such a help to me. I do wish you could have some idea of what a fine man he was in his prime. His sermons were remarkable, and he never wrote them out. He didn't even keep his notes, so that is all gone. I remember a phrase here and there. I think every day about going through those old sermons of mine to see if there were one or two I might want you to read sometime. But there are so many, and I'm afraid, first of all, that most of them might seem foolish or dull to me. It might be best to burn them, but that would upset your mother, who thinks a great deal more of them than I do. For their sheer mass, I suppose, since she hasn't read them. You will probably remember the stairs to the attic are a sort of ladder, and that it is terribly hot up there when it is not terribly cold. It would be worth my life to try to get those big boxes down on my own. It's humiliating to have written as much as Augustine and then have to find a way to dispose of it. There's not a word in any of those sermons I didn't mean when I wrote it. If I had the time, I could read my way through 50 years of my innermost life. What a terrible thought. If I don't burn them, someone else will sometime, and that's another humiliation. This habit of writing is so deep in me, as you will know well enough if this endless letter is in your hands, if it has not been lost or burned also. I suppose it's natural to think about those old boxes of sermons upstairs. They are a record of my life, after all, a sort of foretaste of the Last Judgment, really. So how can I not be curious? Here I was, a pastor of souls, hundreds and hundreds of them over all those years, and I hope I was speaking to them, not only to myself, as it seems to me sometimes when I look back. I still wake up at night thinking, that's what I should have said, or that's what he meant, remembering conversations I had with people years ago, some of them long gone from the world, past any thought of my putting things right with them. And then I do wonder where my attention was, if that is even the question. So there's a lot to unpack there in that passage. He's first talking about at times he feels like an imposter because, as a boy, he was taller than others, so people thought he was older. And then that kind of leads into where he bought a lot of books, and that got him the reputation of having wisdom. But really, he didn't have time to read all those books, and even the books that he did read, he didn't seem to learn much from. So, for me, personally, this hits home, right? Especially the books part. My wife and I love to go out and buy books, and of course, there's never enough time to read them all. And then being able to learn something from the books that you read? Well, if you happen to watch my first video, the introduction to this channel, you'll have seen that part of the reason I started this channel is because I was feeling that I wasn't getting all that I could out of the books I read, right? So I'm hoping by making these videos and forcing myself to spend a little more time with these books and kind of think a little longer and harder on them, that maybe I'm able to get a little more out of them. So beyond that, one of the things he says is, my life does not compare with my grandfather's. And I think he would probably say the same thing about his life compared to his father's or even his brother's. So he feels a sense of inadequacy at this late stage, and maybe there's a sense of regret about his life. His grandfather was a bit of an abolitionist hero in some sense, and his brother moved away and studied abroad in Europe. And we learn a little later that even his parents left Gilead a while ago. Meanwhile, he stayed in this small, nothing town and suffered through his dark time, as he called it, alone. So what can we learn from that? I would say that we have to make the most of everything. Try to do big things in life and go different places and make memories. But also make sure that we're enjoying the simple things in life, your daily life as well. One day we'll all get a phone call telling us to get our affairs in order. And you don't want to look back on your life with regret like it seems that John Ames is doing now. But I think it'll be hard not to. Because there'll always be stuff that you wish you would have done. He also mentions Boughton, which is his good childhood friend, who also became a pastor. Boughton is also aging and not doing well. And one of the things he mentions is Boughton never wrote down any of his sermons. And while John's sermons are all written out on paper, up in the attic, his life's work up in the attic in old boxes, he says he still wakes up in the night thinking of how he could have said something different or better. More regret. Some of this, I think, is just John needing to let go of the past and things maybe he didn't quite get right, or I think there comes a time where we will just have to accept our life and what it was. And I think John's at that point. So John's current wife and son is actually his second family. He had a first wife who he was friends with since childhood, and it sounded like they had a great relationship. Well, she died in childbirth, and his daughter did not survive either. And John mentions that his second wife, the mother to the son who he's writing this letter to, is actually 10 years younger than his daughter would have been. And that seems important as we are introduced to another John Ames. So this time it's John Ames Boughton who goes by Jack. So it seems at a certain point, John's friend Boughton had a son, in a sense, for John. Because John would never have a son. Now this was before John married his second wife. And so it seemed that, John was in those dark times, and Boughton had this son and said, John, you can be the godfather of this son, and we'll even give him your name. So we get a sense that Jack, John Ames Boughton, has done something that disappointed everyone and now has been gone for a number of years. So this is the first time he's been home to Gilead in a while, and there's certainly some tension between John Ames and Jack. So let's go back to the book. Then here comes Jack Boughton, who really is the spitting image of his father in terms of physical likeness, with that same black hair and the same high color. He's just about your mother's age. I remember when she lifted her dear face to me to be baptized, lifted it into winter morning light, new snow light, and I thought, she is neither old nor young, and I was somehow amazed by her, and I could hardly bring myself to touch the water to her brow because she looked a good deal more than beautiful. Sadness was a great part of it, it was. So she has grown younger over the years, and that was because of you. But I have never seen her look so young as she did this morning. Well, the light was fine, and she was in her garden, and you were chasing around in your bare feet, with your shirt off and freckles all over your shoulders. Your mother had put a piece of hot dog on a string and tied it to a stick for you to use in luring Soapy. She called it your catting pole, which is just the kind of silliness you love, and so you had spent the morning catting in the bushes and around the house while I read up on the election campaign. One of the pleasures of these days is that I noticed them all, minute by minute, and this was a fine one. Until I found myself being hoisted to my feet by that Jack Boughton. Then I caught a look on your mother's face, and on yours too, which I know could not have been because of the contrast we made. You didn't wait until this morning to realize that I am old. I don't know what it was I saw, and I'm not going to think about it anymore. It didn't set well with me. He couldn't stay for coffee. Things went well enough. Then he was off. All right, now jumping a few pages ahead. Young Boughton came by to see if you felt like a game of catch. You did. He was sunburned from working in the garden. It gave him a healthy, honest look. He's teaching you to throw overhand. He said he couldn't stay for supper. You were disappointed. as I believe your mother was also. This one seems more like an inner monologue that John is having with himself. It says, question. What is it you fear most, Moritaurus? Answer. I, Moritaurus, fear leaving my wife and child unknowingly in the sway of a man of extremely questionable character. Question. What makes you think his contact with them or his influence upon them will be considerable enough to be damaging to them? So, John has a problem here. His wife and son seem to really like Jack. And there's even a point where Jack shows up to John's church, and the son tells Jack to come sit next to them. And so while John is up there preaching, he has to look out and see Jack sitting next to his wife and son, essentially replacing him. But I get the sense that John's worries are mostly unfounded. For the most part, it's just John's insecurity. He's not able to recognize that his family would definitely put him first, and that Jack is just a nice friend to them. And it seems to me that John lacks some communication skills. You know, for me personally, if I was in John's position, I'd be talking to my wife about my feelings. And I would have told her all about Jack and his past and my thoughts on him. And I don't understand why he wants to keep this a secret from his wife, really. And I also don't understand why his wife isn't asking some of these questions. John's wife gets a book from the library. It's called The Trail of the Lonesome Pine. And she really likes it. And she likes it so much, she doesn't put it down. You know, she's reading it constantly. And it so happens that what the book is about is a similar situation. There's an old man with a younger girl, and he sees her with a man more her own age. And in the end, it all turns out fine. You know, she loves the old man. And one of the things that John says in his letter is, "It strikes me that your mother could not have said a more heartening word to me by any other means than she did by loving that unremarkable book so much that I noticed it and read it too. That was Providence telling me what she could not have told me." So basically his wife is telling him, hey, I love you. And for some reason, John can't seem to let go of his insecurity. And I guess this seems to be one of John's final problems that he needs to work through in his life. This is an important thing, which I have told many people, and which my father told me, and which his father told him. When you encounter another person, when you have dealings with anyone at all, it is as if a question is being put to you. So you must think, what is the Lord asking of me in this moment, in this situation? If you confront insult or antagonism, your first impulse will be to respond in kind. But if you think, as it were, this is an emissary sent from the Lord, and some benefit is intended for me, first of all, the occasion to demonstrate my faithfulness, the chance to show that I do in some small degree participate in the grace that saved me, you are free to act otherwise than as circumstances would seem to dictate. You are free to act by your own lights. I think this is an important point, and it's a bit of a variation on one of Jordan Peterson's rules. Rule 9 says, assume that the person you are listening to might know something you don't. So even during difficult encounters with other people, we have to assume that we will learn something from it. Or we at least need to try to learn something from it. You know, maybe there's something within the encounter that's going to make us a better person in the long run. So, John continues to work through his insecurities, and meanwhile, he finally lets out what Jack's secret was and why he left Gilead for so many years. Jack had gotten a young, very poor girl pregnant, never acknowledged the child, and then basically ran away. And Jack's family tried to help care for that child, but the mother, the young girl, was in a very bad home situation and basically couldn't be helped. So the baby lived only about 3 years until it cut its foot and then died of an infection. And John goes on to tell us that, Jack had always been kind of a dangerously mischievous youth. But, this deal with the girl and the child was the final episode. And so now, after years, Jack is back. And Jack and John try a couple of times to have an honest conversation with each other. And it's very difficult for both of them. Jack seems to always offend John. And you get the sense that maybe he's trying not to. And maybe he really is trying to work through some things himself. And he's looking to John for maybe some guidance. After all, John is his godfather, right? They have the same name. And it seems one of the things that Jack is working through is his belief in God. And it would seem appropriate that he would go to John for guidance on that, since John, after all, is a pastor. But John always seems to take offense to any questions that Jack brings up. And I don't know if he thinks that Jack is trying to mock religion or what exactly he's thinking, but he's not helpful, really. And he's always pushing Jack away and taking offense to whatever Jack comes at him with. Okay, and going back into the book, there's an occasion where Jack and John were having a bit of a discussion, and then it hits a certain point where they kind of have some quiet time. Here's what it says. So we were just quiet there for some time. Your mother came out with a pot of hot cider and cups, and she sat there quiet, right along with us, the dear woman. And I spent the time thinking how it would be if Jack Boughton were indeed my son, and had come home weary from whatever life he had, and was sitting there still, and at seeming peace in that peaceful night. There was a considerable satisfaction in that thought. The idea of grace had been so much on my mind. Grace as a sort of ecstatic fire that takes things down to essentials. There in the dark and the quiet, I felt I could forget all the tedious particulars and just feel the presence of his mortal and immortal being. And a sensation came over me, a sort of lovely fear that made me think of Boughton's fear of angels. Now, I may have been more than half asleep at that point, but a thought arose that abides with me. I wished I could sit at the feet of the eternal soul and learn. He did then seem to me the angel of himself, brooding over the mysteries his mortal life describes, the deep things of man. And of course that is exactly what he is. For who among men knoweth the things of a man, save the spirit of the man which is in him? In every important way, we are such secrets from each other. And I do believe that there is a separate language in each of us, also a separate aesthetics and a separate jurisprudence. Every single one of us is a little civilization built on the ruins of any number of preceding civilizations, but with our own variant notions of what is beautiful and what is acceptable, which, I hasten to add, we generally do not satisfy, and by which we struggle to live. When we're talking to someone, do we really know who we're talking to? I mean, we might think we do, but we'll never be certain of their innermost thoughts and feelings. Bruce Springsteen wrote a great song called Brilliant Disguise, and in the song he says, "So tell me what I see when I look in your eyes. Is that you, baby, or just a brilliant disguise?" And then by the end of the song, he changes it a little bit. "So when you look at me, you better look hard and look twice. Is that me, baby, or just a brilliant disguise?" So along the same lines, we might say it's hard for other people to really know us. And honestly, it's hard for us to even try to know ourselves. Then he said, "I stayed away from this town for a long time, as a courtesy to my father mainly. I might never have come back. I asked him what made him change his mind. It took him a while to answer. For several reasons, I felt I needed to speak with him, my father. But, he said, somehow when I came here, I didn't expect to see him so very old. The last few years have been hard on him. He put his hand to his eyes. I said, "It's done him good to have you here." He shook his head. "You talked with him yesterday." "Yes, he did seem a little worried about you." He laughed. "A few days ago, Glory said to me, 'He's fragile. We don't want to kill him. We.' It's true, though. I don't want to kill him, so I thought I might be able to speak with you. This will be my last attempt. I promise." I almost reminded him that my own health is not perfect, which would have been foolish, since on second thought, I could not really imagine that any revelation he might make would strike me down. He took a little leather case out of his breast pocket and opened it and held it in front of me. His hand was not steady, and I had to put on my reading glasses, but then I could see it fairly well. It was posed like a portrait photograph. Himself, a young woman, and a boy about 5 or 6. The woman was seated in a chair with the child standing next to her, and a young Boughton was standing behind them. It was Jack Boughton, a colored woman, and a light-skinned colored boy. Boughton looked at the picture, and then he snapped the case shut and slipped it back into his pocket. He said, "You see?" And his voice was so controlled it sounded bitter. "You see, I also have a wife and child." Then he just watched me for a minute or two, clearly hoping he would not have to take offense. "That's a fine-looking family," I said. He nodded. "She's a fine woman. He's a fine boy. I'm a lucky man," he smiled. "And you're afraid this might kill your father?" He shrugged. "It came near enough killing her father. And her mother. They cursed the day I was born." He laughed and touched his hand to his face. "As you know, I have considerable experience antagonizing people. But this is on another level entirely." I was thinking my own thoughts. So he said, "Maybe not. Maybe that's just how it seems to me." And then he sat there, studying his hands. And now jumping ahead just a page. I remarked that we have never had those laws here in Iowa. And he said, "Yes, Iowa, the shining star of radicalism." So I asked him if he came here to be married. He shook his head. "Her father doesn't want her to marry me. Her father is also a minister, by the way. I suppose that was inevitable. And there is a good Christian man down there in Tennessee, a friend of the family, who is willing to marry my wife and adopt my son. They think this is very kind of him. I suppose it is. They believe it would be best for everybody." He said, "And the fact is, I have had considerable difficulty looking after my family. From time to time, they have gone back to Tennessee when things were too difficult. That's where they are now." He said, "I can't really ask her to make a final break with her family under the circumstances." He cleared his throat. We were just quiet. So all the while, John has been insecure about Jack replacing him with his family. Jack seems to be suffering from the same thing. He's worried that someone, a good Christian man down in Tennessee, is going to marry his wife and take his family away from him. And Jack's worries might be more material than John's. And this seems to me just a version of you never know what other people are going through. You know, it seems to me at this point that Jack has come back looking for family, friends, and guidance. But some of the people he's seeking that that help from, John in particular, are pushing him away for whatever reason. And I think part of this demonstrates that there are consequences for your actions. And sometimes there are long-standing consequences. If you wrong someone, you shouldn't count on them welcoming you back with open arms. And Jack didn't necessarily wrong John. Well, actually he did. As a kid, John mentions there was a couple times, I believe, where, Jack actually did wrong John. But then he has this final episode where he runs away from this girl and child that he has. And so I think John is still struggling with that to some degree. But I think John is also trying to come around and see Jack's point of view, especially now knowing this information. John might realize that, maybe Jack wasn't so interested in replacing him with his family. Maybe he was really just seeking some friendship, and some sense of, coming home. So how the story ends is John catches Jack on the street and notices he's walking to the bus stop and asks him if he's heading back to Memphis. And Jack says he's heading anywhere but Memphis. He says he finally received the letter he'd been waiting for, which I didn't quite understand, but I took it to mean that he had received the letter from his wife saying that she was going to go off and marry that man in Tennessee. And so Jack is now on his own, says he's never going to come back to Gilead again. So John walks Jack to the bus stop and tries to give him some words of encouragement. And the last thing that John can think to do in order to, help his godson is he asks Jack, "Can I bless you?" And kind of knowing that Jack is an atheist and that they're out there in the public space at a bus stop, he knows that this request might be a futile request. But Jack agrees. And so right there at the bus stop, in front of everybody, John blesses Jack. And there seems to be some sort of closure to their relationship there. So that's Gilead by Marilynne Robinson. Let me know in the comments your reaction to the book or what you happen to get out of it, any lessons learned that you took from it. Thanks for watching.